It was a crisp, early morning when Devin received the news he'd been anxiously awaiting. His name was at the top of the list for a promotion to sergeant. To most people, it might have been a simple procedural update, but to Devin, it felt like a monumental step forward in a career that had already been a series of small victories against a deeply entrenched system of racial bias. However, Devin's joy was short-lived. A week later, the promotion was given to Officer Ben Crawford, a white officer who had been with the department for just 2 years longer than Devin and whose performance had been, at best, mediocre. Crawford was a smooth talker, always charming the right people at the right time. Devin couldn't help but feel the sting of disappointment. It wasn't the first time he'd been passed over for an opportunity he had earned. He'd seen it happen before, white officers with less experience and fewer qualifications, moving up the ranks while he remained stuck, forced to work twice as hard to be seen as equal. It wasn't just the promotion, it was the daily microaggressions, the underestimation, the way people hesitated to trust his judgment simply because of his race. Devin had long known that this was part of the struggle. But as time went on, he couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on his spirit. It wasn't just about proving his worth, it was about breaking through a ceiling that seemed impenetrable. Within the precinct, the tension between Devin and his colleagues was palpable, even if unspoken. He had always done his best to maintain professionalism, to keep his head down and focus on the work. But some things couldn't be ignored. Captain Richards, a seasoned officer with decades of service, had always kept a cold distance from Devin. There were no outright confrontations, no overt racism, but the subtle signs were impossible to miss. The dismissive tone when speaking to him, the lack of praise for his work, and the routine disregard for his input during meetings. It was clear that Richards saw Devin as someone who still had to prove himself. But it wasn't just Richards. Many of the other officers, though not openly hostile, treated Devin with a quiet condescension. It wasn't overt. It was in the small things, being left out of the decision-making process, being asked to handle the more tedious tasks. At times, Devin tried to stay optimistic, telling himself that things would change. But there were days when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. His colleagues, unaware of the emotional toll it was taking on him, continued to operate as if it were just part of the job. But for Devin, each day was a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, how many cases he solved, how much he sacrificed, it would never be enough to erase the prejudice that lingered in the air. Among the officers in the precinct, one person always seemed to stand out to Devin, not for any particular reason beyond the fact that she was a rare, calming presence in an environment that was often tense and fraught with conflict. Officer Maya Thomas had been partnered with Devin on several shifts, and despite her quiet nature, she was one of the few officers who didn't seem to judge him based on his race. Maya, a white officer, was new to the force but had already gained a reputation for her level-headedness. She had grown up in a small town where racial divisions were less pronounced, and she had arrived at the precinct with an open heart and mind. However, her naivety about the depth of racial tension in law enforcement was evident. Maya had witnessed the occasional uncomfortable glance or snide comment, but she never fully understood what Devin went through daily, until recently. She admired Devin's resilience, but she was unaware of just how deeply the systemic racial issues within the precinct affected him. Maya often found herself in the middle of tense situations, unsure of how to navigate them. While she remained supportive, Devin knew that Maya's neutrality sometimes meant she chose to stay out of the more difficult conversations that involved race and power. It wasn't the first time Devin had seen it happen. An officer, less qualified and less experienced, being given a promotion he so clearly deserved. But this time, the sting was sharper. His name had been on the list for sergeant, and he was sure that this time, things would be different. When the announcement came, the promotion went to Ben Crawford, a white officer who, while competent, had not demonstrated the leadership or track record that Devin had. Crawford's success wasn't based on his skills, but on his charm and connections, both inside and outside the precinct. The frustration Devin felt was unmistakable. This wasn't just about a missed opportunity. This was about the deeper, unspoken rules that governed how things worked within the department. Devin had done everything right. He'd worked harder, stayed longer, proved himself again and again. Yet it didn't matter. The system was always set up to give someone else the upper hand. It was hard not to see the racial bias at play when officers like Crawford coasted by on charm while black officers like Devin had to work 10 times harder for the same recognition. Devin's frustration continued to build in ways that he couldn't easily ignore. It wasn't just the promotion. It was the everyday moments, small, sharp reminders of the biases that crept into every corner of his job. Whether it was the way certain officers spoke to him, the way his ideas were dismissed in meetings, or the lingering glances of disbelief when he made a suggestion, each moment added to the growing weight on his shoulders. Even when he excelled in the field, earning praise from the community for solving tough cases, there was always an undercurrent of doubt that seemed to follow him. Why wasn't he more well-liked? Why did it seem like people always second-guessed his decisions? At the same time, there was an internal conflict brewing within him. Devin had always believed in the principles of justice and fairness that his badge stood for. He had wanted to become a police officer to serve and protect, to make a difference in his community. But with every passing day, the truth became harder to deny. The system wasn't designed for people like him to succeed. It wasn't just the occasional incident. It was the weight of institutionalized racism that seemed impossible to overcome. It was an exhausting cycle. But Devin refused to let the weight break him. For all the setbacks and slights, he kept pushing forward, hoping that things would change. But deep down, he knew the only way to change things was to confront the biases head-on. It was supposed to be a routine call, a traffic stop. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so they thought. Devin and Maya were patrolling the downtown area when a dispatch came through about a high-end car driving erratically. It wasn't a typical stop for them. In fact, it seemed like a simple case of someone speeding or being distracted behind the wheel. They'd handle it like they had handled hundreds of others before. The car in question was a sleek, black Lexus, with tinted windows and a polished shine that reflected the afternoon sun. It was the kind of car that screamed wealth and privilege, a stark contrast to the older, run-down vehicles that often passed through the precinct's radar. The driver, a well-dressed black woman, pulled over immediately when Devin activated the siren. As they approached the vehicle, Devin noticed the woman's calm demeanor. She sat upright, hands resting on the steering wheel, her eyes meeting theirs through the rearview mirror. Crystal Williams, as her license would later show, appeared composed, not a hint of panic on her face. But it was clear from the moment she rolled down her window that something felt off. Ben Crawford, who had arrived a few seconds behind them, walked up to the car with a sense of superiority that Devin could immediately feel. As much as he tried to ignore it, the tension was building. The way Crawford looked at the woman, sizing her up as if she didn't belong in a car like that, was almost palpable. Devin couldn't shake the feeling that this stop, unlike any other, was going to be different. Despite the tension crackling in the air, Crystal Williams remained composed. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, her posture upright and dignified. There was no panic in her eyes, no sign of fear, even though she was aware of the subtle hostility radiating from Officer Crawford. When she rolled down her window, she greeted them with a controlled, polite tone. "Good afternoon, officers," she said, her voice steady. Her eyes flickered from Devin to Crawford, gauging them both with a calm intensity. Devin could see the contrast between Crystal's cool demeanor and the unease radiating from Crawford. It wasn't hard to see that she was aware of the social dynamics at play. It wasn't her first time being pulled over by the police, and she knew that how she responded could mean the difference between a routine encounter and something much worse. But instead of succumbing to fear, she chose to remain poised, to hold on to her sense of self-respect in the face of what felt like an unjust situation. It wasn't lost on Devin. This was not just another traffic stop. This was a moment where dignity itself was being challenged, and Crystal wasn't backing down. Devin felt his stomach twist as the stop unfolded. He had seen this all before, officers like Crawford using their position to make others feel small, to assert dominance without justification. As much as Devin wanted to stay neutral, a familiar voice in his head urged him to step in. He was a cop just like Crawford, sworn to protect and serve. But this situation wasn't as straightforward as a traffic violation. The undertones of racial bias were too loud to ignore. Crawford's approach to Crystal wasn't one of professionalism. It was condescending, dismissive, and overtly aggressive. Devin hesitated. He could feel the weight of his badge pressing against him, the responsibility it carried. Was he supposed to intervene? Could he? He had always been the one to play it safe, to avoid confrontation, but deep down he knew this wasn't right. Yet, there was a part of him that feared speaking out. The fear of being ostracized by his colleagues, labeled as someone who stirred trouble, weighed heavily on him. As the words swirled in his mind, he realized that this was no longer just about right and wrong. It was about his own place in this system, whether he would be complicit in perpetuating it, or whether he would stand against it, risking everything he had worked for. As Crystal continued to remain calm and composed, Crawford's demeanor shifted. What had started as a standard traffic stop was quickly morphing into something more aggressive. His voice grew sharper, more condescending, as he demanded Crystal to step out of the car. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle now," he said, his tone a command rather than a request. His eyes narrowed, as though looking for any reason, any excuse to escalate the situation further. Crystal, still maintaining her composure, didn't immediately comply. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. "Am I free to go?" Crawford's response was immediate, his anger barely contained. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just step out of the car." Devin could feel the temperature rise. He had seen this before, the manipulation, the way some officers would escalate situations just to justify their authority. It wasn't lost on him that Crawford wasn't asking to de-escalate. No, this wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about asserting dominance. His heart began to race. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was racial bias in motion. Maya watched the interaction unfold, but she couldn't bring herself to step in. She saw how the situation was escalating, how Crawford's hostility was pushing Crystal closer to the edge. Her instincts screamed at her to intervene, to step in and stop what was clearly an abuse of power. But she hesitated. It wasn't that Maya didn't want to help. She did. She just didn't know how. She had never been trained for this. She had never been in a position where she needed to confront the deep-rooted biases within her own precinct, her own partner. The racial dynamics were something she was only beginning to understand, and it left her feeling uncertain and unsure of her place in this moment. She looked over at Devin, hoping that he would take the lead, but she could see the internal battle within him. He seemed torn, caught between doing what was right and protecting his career. Maya's hands were trembling slightly, but she kept them clenched by her side, feeling helpless as the situation spiraled out of control. Her silence, while not intentional, made her feel complicit in the moment. But how could she intervene when she wasn't sure who, if anyone, would back her up? Crystal felt her pulse quicken, but her face remained an unshakable mask of calm. She had seen too many interactions like this, far too many times, and she knew how this could unfold if she allowed fear to dictate her actions. When Crawford barked his command to get out of the car, Crystal didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. Her movements were deliberate, measured. She wasn't afraid, but she was aware of the potential danger in every step. As she stood outside the car, she locked eyes with Crawford, standing tall, refusing to let him diminish her presence. "I am not resisting," she said, her voice cool and steady. "I'm simply asserting my rights. I haven't done anything wrong. If you're detaining me, I'd like to know why." Her words hung in the air, calm but assertive. She wasn't backing down, but she also wasn't engaging in the kind of confrontation that would give Crawford any excuse to escalate further. Devin watched in awe as Crystal spoke, aware of how important this moment was. In the face of aggression, she stood strong, not just for herself but for anyone who had ever been in her position. She wasn't just a woman standing up to an officer. She was embodying a resistance that had been fought by countless others before her. Devin felt a shiver run down his spine as the tension in the air thickened. Every instinct in him screamed to intervene, to stop Crawford before this escalated any further. But the hesitation that had gripped him earlier still held tight, making his throat dry and his palms sweat. He could see it in Crystal's eyes. She wasn't backing down, and neither should he. Yet something inside him wavered. Was he ready to make this stand? Was he ready to risk everything he had worked for? Finally, the pressure inside him became too much. He couldn't stand by anymore. Not when he knew what was happening was wrong. "Crawford, stop." Devin's voice was firm, but it trembled with uncertainty. "This isn't right. You need to de-escalate." His words hung in the air for a moment, caught between fear and resolve. He had said it, but in that split second he realized how much was at stake. Could he really stand up against a senior officer? Could he stand up for what was right, even if it meant jeopardizing his future in the department? Crawford turned to Devin, his face hardening. "What did you say, Harris?" Devin swallowed, his heart racing. He had spoken, but now the consequences were looming. Crawford's expression shifted from surprise to something far darker. His nostrils flared as his eyes narrowed at Devin. The air between them crackled with hostility, and Devin could feel the weight of the senior officer's anger bearing down on him. "You don't tell me what to do, Harris?" Crawford sneered, his tone sharp with aggression. "You think you're better than me? You think you can play hero and lecture me?" Before Devin could respond, Crawford took a step forward, his hand reaching for Crystal's arm. "Step away from the vehicle now," he barked, pulling her roughly away from the door. Crystal recoiled slightly, but she stood her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I've done nothing wrong," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not going to let you treat me like a criminal." Crawford's face twisted in frustration, and with a vicious shove, he forced her further from the car. The scene was spiraling, and Devin could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. Crawford was looking for a fight, and Crystal was caught in the crossfire. But now Devin was too. The question wasn't whether the situation would explode. It was how far this would go before someone took a stand. The tipping point came suddenly. It was as though Devin's world had narrowed to the space between him and Crawford. Everything seemed to slow down, his senses heightening. The flashing lights, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Only this moment mattered now. Devin could feel his breath catch in his throat, but something inside him snapped. The pressure, the frustration, the years of watching injustice go unchecked. It was all too much. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a witness to a wrong that needed to be righted. "Enough, Crawford!" Devin's voice rang out, louder than before, each word cutting through the tension. "What you're doing is wrong. You're escalating this for no reason. I saw it. You're planting evidence." The words felt like they had come from someone else, someone stronger, more confident. It wasn't just a warning now, it was a challenge. Crawford froze, his face a mask of disbelief. For a split second, he seemed unsure of how to respond. But then the scorn returned, sharper than ever. "You're out of your mind, Harris?" Crawford growled, taking a step toward him, chest puffed in defiance. "You don't know what you're talking about. Get in line, or I'll make sure you regret this." Devin's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice didn't waver. "I'm not backing down. I saw what you did, and I'm not going to stay silent." The crowd that had begun to gather now murmured in agreement, recording the confrontation on their phones. Devin knew it wasn't just the two of them anymore. This was bigger than him and Crawford. It was about accountability, about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Devin's eyes widened as he watched Crawford move with alarming precision. He saw the subtle flick of Crawford's wrist as he reached into his pocket, retrieving a small plastic bag. Devin's heart sank as he realized what was about to happen. In one smooth motion, Crawford bent down and placed the bag under the front seat of Crystal's car. It was a setup. Crystal had done nothing wrong, yet Crawford was going to frame her. The horror of the moment hit Devin like a punch to the gut. He had seen corruption and misconduct in the system, but this was different. This wasn't just an unfair treatment or a power trip. This was cold, calculated manipulation. Devin's blood ran cold. He knew that once the evidence was planted, it would be impossible for Crystal to prove her innocence without someone brave enough to expose the truth. He glanced around, looking for any sign of support, but the crowd was still too distant, too focused on their phones to notice the true nature of what was happening. In that moment, Devin made a decision. He couldn't look the other way. He couldn't be complicit in this. Maya stood frozen, her hands still resting on her gun as she watched the scene unfold. She had always prided herself on being objective, neutral even in the most tense of situations. But this was different. This wasn't a case of overreaction or miscommunication. It was something far darker. She saw the whole thing. Crawford's movements were too precise, too practiced. The way he dropped the bag under the seat, it was deliberate, intentional. Maya's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. She glanced at Devin, hoping for some kind of reassurance, some sign that he was as disturbed by this as she was. But his face was set in a way she had never seen before. His eyes were locked on Crawford, and for the first time, there was no uncertainty, no hesitation. He knew what needed to be done. Maya's mind raced. She wanted to do something, anything, to stop Crawford. But fear gripped her. She had never been in this kind of situation before. She wasn't sure what the right thing to do was, or even if she was ready to pay the price for doing it. Still, she couldn't shake the sick feeling in her stomach. This wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. As the tension in the air grew, the first few bystanders began to notice the escalating situation. A couple of people, initially drawn by the flashing lights, started to gather at a safe distance, smartphones raised, recording every move, every word. At first, it was just a few curious passersby, the kind who'd always wondered what went on behind the scenes of these traffic stops. But soon, more people trickled in, drawn by the murmur of voices and the visible agitation in the officers' behavior. The crowd began to grow, their presence filling the space around the vehicle, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. For Devin, the feeling of being watched was both a comfort and a pressure. On one hand, he was aware that the eyes of the crowd made it harder for Crawford to escalate things further. But on the other hand, it meant that everything happening now would be recorded. Every word, every movement, every choice. There would be no turning back. But what made it even more intense was the subtle shift in the crowd's energy. What had started as idle curiosity was quickly turning into something else. Something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. The more the crowd gathered, the more the stakes were raised. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Devin's mind raced. He had seen enough to know exactly what Crawford was doing. He had watched the evidence being planted, and now there was no turning back. It wasn't just about standing up for Crystal anymore. It was about doing the right thing, no matter the consequences. For a moment, Devin found himself paralyzed by the enormity of the decision in front of him. He had been trained to follow orders, to trust the chain of command, to support his colleagues, no matter what. But now, all those rules seemed so hollow in the face of this blatant injustice. Was it really his responsibility to expose Crawford? Was he really prepared to risk everything for the truth? As he stood there watching Crawford, he realized the answer was clear. He couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He couldn't pretend that what was happening wasn't wrong. Not when he had the power to do something about it. Devin took a deep breath, his hand gripping his radio as if it might offer some kind of support. He knew what needed to be done. He had to act, and he had to act now. The moment had arrived. Devin took one final step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his throat, a strange mixture of fear and determination filling him. He knew that what he was about to do would change everything. There was no going back after this moment. Crawford. Devin's voice broke through the tense silence, low but clear. His words felt heavier than he intended, as if the weight of what he was about to say had the potential to shatter everything around him. I saw what you did. I saw you plant that evidence. Crawford's eyes snapped toward him, a flash of anger crossing his face. The smug, confident look that had been there earlier evaporated, replaced by something darker. You saw nothing, Harris? Crawford growled, his voice low but sharp, a threatening edge to it. I suggest you keep your mouth shut. But Devin stood his ground. His eyes never left Crawford's, his jaw set with the kind of resolve that had been building inside him for weeks, months, maybe even years. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up to a broken system. "I'm not letting you get away with this," Devin replied, his voice steady now. The crowd around them, now fully aware of the confrontation, was watching with bated breath, the tension in the air thickening. The silence that followed Devin's declaration was deafening. Crawford's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a split second, the world around them seemed to slow down. The only sound the faint rustle of the crowd, the distant hum of traffic, and the low, seething anger in Crawford's voice as he spoke. "You don't know what you're messing with, Harris," Crawford warned, his words laced with venom. "You're making a huge mistake. If you go through with this, I'll ruin your career. No one will ever trust you again. I'll make sure you never work in this department again. You think they'll back you? They won't." The words hit Devin like a cold slap, but instead of fear, he felt a surge of clarity. Crawford was trying to intimidate him, trying to make him doubt himself, but it was too late. The truth had already set its course. "I don't care what you threaten me with," Devin said, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about me. It's about what's right. And what you did was wrong." Crawford's face twisted in rage, his hand tightening around the handle of his baton. But before he could act, a voice cut through the air, stronger than any of them expected. Maya had been standing to the side, watching the exchange between Devin and Crawford. She had never seen Devin so determined, so fearless. And in that moment, something within her shifted. The confusion, the hesitation that had held her back before. Everything melted away. She had been silent, afraid to speak up, afraid of the consequences. But now, seeing the courage in Devin's eyes, she realized she couldn't stand by anymore. Not when she knew the truth, not when it was so clear that standing by and doing nothing would be a betrayal of everything she believed in. Maya stepped forward, her voice breaking the tension like a crack of thunder. "Devin's right," she said, her words carrying a force she didn't know she had. "What Crawford did is wrong, and I won't stay silent anymore." The crowd, still recording, began murmuring in shock, their gaze shifting between Maya and the two officers. "I'm with Devin," Maya continued, her eyes locked on Crawford, a fierce resolve now replacing the uncertainty she had once felt. "And I won't let this go." For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The power dynamic had shifted. Maya had taken a stand, and it was a stand that would change everything. The air was thick with tension, and the eyes of everyone in the crowd were trained on the officers, waiting for the next move. But just as it seemed like the confrontation between Devin, Crawford, and Maya might spiral out of control, Crystal, who had been standing to the side, finally spoke up. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice calm but firm. Her words caught everyone off guard, and for a moment, the group fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Devin was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed Crystal was just a civilian caught in the middle of a police dispute. But now, the way she spoke, the confidence in her tone, it was clear that there was more to her than he had realized. "I'm not just some random driver," Crystal continued, meeting Devin's gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm an undercover investigator, internal affairs. I've been monitoring this precinct for months. Crawford's actions? It's all part of a pattern. I've seen it before." The words hit like a bombshell. Maya's eyes widened in disbelief, and Crawford's face paled, his confident demeanor shattering in an instant. This was no longer just an issue between two officers. It was a full-blown scandal, and Crystal was the key to unraveling it all. Devin's mind raced. He had never suspected Crystal was part of internal affairs. The weight of the moment hit him, and he realized just how far the corruption ran. But now, with Crystal's revelation, everything was falling into place. The pieces were coming together, and the truth was about to come to light. The world seemed to collapse around Officer Ben Crawford as the weight of Crystal's revelation settled in. His face turned ashen, his body stiff with disbelief. The smug arrogance that had defined him vanished in an instant, replaced by a palpable sense of panic. Crystal's words echoed in his mind, each one a hammer strike shattering the walls he had built around his own twisted reality. He had thought he was untouchable, above reproach, And now, his lies were unraveling before his very eyes. The crowd that had gathered, once divided in their attention, now turned as one. Their gaze, once uncertain, was focused, full of judgment. The phones that had been recording the earlier confrontation now captured every moment of Crawford's downfall, every tremble in his hands, every shift of his posture as the truth emerged. Devin stood tall, his heart pounding, but the surge of relief was almost overwhelming. He had done it. He had taken the first step toward justice. His eyes flicked to Maya, who stood beside him, her expression one of silent triumph. But it wasn't just the crowd's reaction that mattered. It was the look of defeat in Crawford's eyes. That was the moment of truth. The officer who had once seemed so untouchable, so above the law, was now standing on the edge of a precipice. As the weight of the community's disapproval bore down on him, Crawford's bravado cracked. He had no choice but to surrender. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Officer Ben Crawford was arrested, his badge and gun confiscated as the precinct's integrity came under intense scrutiny. The truth had come to light, not just because of Crystal's revelation, but because Devin and Maya had found the courage to act when no one else would. Devin stood outside the precinct, watching as the first of many police vehicles left with Crawford in handcuffs. The scene was surreal. What had started as a routine traffic stop had transformed into something far bigger, something that could change the future of policing in their city. Maya stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. They had made it through the storm together, and now they would rebuild. "I never thought I'd see the day," Maya said softly, her voice carrying a hint of wonder. "But you did it, Devin. You brought the truth to light." Devin nodded, his eyes focused on the road ahead, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. "This is just the beginning, Maya," he replied. "This fight doesn't end with one arrest. It's bigger than Crawford. It's about changing the system." As they turned to walk back into the precinct, Devin felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was hope. Change was coming slowly, but surely, and Devin Harris was ready to lead the charge. For more chilling true time crime stories, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like and share.